Hello, this is a short webinar of 6 stories of heroism and bravery on the 100-year anniversary of the sinking of the Titanic 10-part series on the Worldview Training YouTube channel. And there'll be thoughtful questions for you to consider as an individual or group at the end. Now, I must say, for this particular part of this training series, the concepts of bravery, courage, morality, faith, manhood, and womanhood are presented as told in this book that was written 100 years ago after the sinking of the Titanic. I'm going to present these concepts as they're written in the book. If these concepts are troubling to you or offensive, you may choose not to watch this video, but I'll present these as they were presented 100 years ago, and it'll give us a good contrast with what our culture was like then and what our culture is like now. The book goes on to say this: up to this time there had been no panic. But about an hour before the ship plunged to the bottom, there were 3 separate explosions of the bulkheads as the vessel filled. These were at intervals of about 15 minutes. From that time there was a very different scene. The rush for the remaining boats became a stampede. Scenes on the sinking vessel grew more tragic as the remaining passengers faced the awful certainty that death must be the portion of the majority. Death in the darkness of a wintry sea studded with its ice monuments like the marble shafts in some vast cemetery. In that hour, when cherished illusions of possible safety had all but vanished, manhood and womanhood aboard the Titanic rose to their sublimest heights. Our first story is that of Major Archibald Butt. This is what was said about him by a survivor. The world should rise in praise of Major Butt. That man's conduct will remain in my memory forever. The American Army is honored by him and the way he taught some of the other men how to behave when women and children were suffering that awful mental fear of death. When the time came, he was a man to be feared. In one of the earlier boats, 50 women, it seemed, were about to be lowered when a man suddenly, panic-stricken, ran to the stern of it. Major Butt shot one arm out, caught him by the back of the neck, and jerked him backwards like a pillow. His head cracked against a rail, and he was stunned. "Sorry," said Major Butt. "Women will be attended for first, or I'll break every damned bone in your body." A little while later, a young man was arguing to get in a lifeboat, and Major Butt had a hold of the lad by the arm like a big brother, and was telling him to keep his head and to be a man. Major Butt helped those poor frightened steerage people so wonderfully, so tenderly, and yet with such cool and manly firmness that he prevented the loss of many lives from panic. He was a soldier to the last. He was one of God's greatest noblemen, and I think I can say he was an example of bravery even to men on the ship. A second story, Miss Elizabeth Evans. "Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends," says the book. Miss Elizabeth Evans fulfilled this final test of affection laid down by the Divine Master. The girl was the niece of the wife of a magistrate from Cornell of New York. She was placed in the same boat with many other women. As it was about to be lowered away, it was found that the craft contained one more than its full quota of passengers. The question arose as to which of them should surrender their place and their chance of safety. Mrs. J. Brown, a mother of several children, was sitting beside Miss Evans. Elizabeth quickly volunteered to give up her seat. She said, "Your need is greater than mine," she said. "You have children who need you, and I have none." She stood up and stepped back on the deck. She found no later refuge and was one of those who went down with the ship. She was 25 years old and was beloved by all who knew her. An example of sacrificial womanhood. Benjamin Guggenheim. When Mr. Guggenheim realized that there was grave dangers, said the room steward, he advised his secretary, who also died, to dress fully, and he himself did the same. Mr. Guggenheim was cool and collected as he was pulling on his outer garments, and said to the steward, "I think there's grave doubt that the men will get off safely. I am willing to remain and play the man's game if there are not enough boats for more than the women and children. I won't die here like a beast. I'll meet my end as a man. Tell my wife, Johnson, if it should happen that my secretary and I both go down and you are saved, tell her I played the game out straight and to the end. No woman shall be left aboard this ship because of Ben Guggenheim was a coward. Tell her that my last thoughts will be of her and our girls, but that my duty now is to these unfortunate women and children on this ship. Tell her I will meet whatever fate is in store for me, knowing she will approve of what I do. Guggenheim was a man of means, but gave up his life for others. The bandsmen. The bandsmen in the movie Titanic are portrayed somewhat as if they were in denial, not really in tune with the situation. But as we read here, those that experienced the sinking of the Titanic with them saw their act of playing to the end as an act of pure bravery and courage. As the vessel disappeared, the waves drowned the majestic hymn which the musicians played as they went to their watery grave. The most authentic accounts agree that this hymn was not Nearer My God to Thee, which it seems have been played shortly before, but Autumn, which is found in the Episcopal hymnal and which fits appropriately the situation on the Titanic in the last moments of pain and darkness there. One line in the hymn Autumn says, "Hold me up in mighty waters." Particularly that line may have suggested the hymn to a minister on board, John Harper, who I'll mention later, who thought that the band playing that might bring comfort to the passengers that were still on board, and acted as a last service aboard the sinking ship. It was the musicians of the band of the Titanic, poor men, paid a few dollars a week, who played the music to keep up the courage of the souls aboard the sinking ship. The way the band kept playing was a noble thing, says the wireless operator. The last I saw of the band when I was floating, struggling in the icy waters, it was still on deck playing Autumn. How those brave fellows ever did it, I cannot imagine. The Titanic engineers. There were brave men below deck, too, the book says. A lot has been printed in the papers about the heroism of the officers, said one survivor, but little has been said of the bravery of the men below the decks. In the list of heroes who went down on the Titanic, the names of her engineers will have a high place, for not a single engineer was saved. Many of them, no doubt, could not get to the deck, but they had equally as good a chance as the firemen, 69 of whom were saved. The supposition of those who manned the Titanic was that the engineers working below were the first to know the desperate character of the Titanic's injury. All these men helped rake the fires out from 10 of the forward boilers after the crash. This delayed the explosion and undoubtedly permitted the ship to remain afloat nearly an hour longer and thus saved hundreds of lives. It was the engineers who kept the lights going, saw to the proper closing of the bulkhead doors, and kept the stoke hole at work until the usefulness of the task was apparent. Most of them probably died at their posts of duty. I was told that 17 engine men, who were drowned side by side, got down on their knees on the platform of the engine room and prayed until the water surged up to their necks. Then they stood up, clasped hands together so as to form a circle, and died together. And here are 2 memorials to the Titanic engineers in Southampton, England, and in Liverpool. Finally, a story from a pastor on board, the Reverend John Harper. He was a 39-year-old widower traveling with a 6-year-old daughter, and he became famous pastor in London and in Chicago, and he was traveling back to Chicago to do ministry there. He realized the seriousness of the problem. He got a 6-year-old daughter and his niece into a boat. He called out to other believers to let others go first that did not have faith. He gathered and prayed for the people left on the ship, and he gave up his life belt to someone else that was not a person of faith at that time. In the water after Titanic went down, he swam as best he could from person to person to call them to faith and to trust in Christ. And I tell the John Harper story in a longer webinar at a different time in this series. As I close now, here's a dedication from the front of the book. To the 1,635 souls who were lost with the ill-fated Titanic, and especially to those heroic men who, instead of trying to save themselves, stood aside that women and children might have their chance, of each of them let it be written, as it was written of the greater one, he died, that others might live. So in this day and age, here are questions for consideration. What would you die for? Would you die for another human being whom you do not know? Where would you get the internal fortitude to make such a decision? What does your faith tell you about such action? Where do you get your confidence in facing death? Answer these questions for yourselves or in a group, and let me suggest 2 resources for you that you can take further. The 21-Day Faith Experiment that you can find at the 21dayfaithexperiment.org or uscivicstraining.org to get a grasp again on the value of a culture and a worldview and what it means for us today. My name's Craig Seibert. Thanks for listening.